The pop of the Dom Perignon cork echoed through the VIP lounge like a starting pistol. Zelda raised his glass, the golden liquid catching the low light of the club, and grinned at the young, blonde woman clinging to his arm. "To freedom," he declared, his voice cutting through the thumping bass, "and to dropping dead weight." He had just finalized his divorce, walking away with the house, his luxury car, and his six-figure corporate salary intact. He thought he had outsmarted his quiet, unassuming ex-wife. He thought he had won. What Zelda didn't know was that while he was drinking to his newly single life, his ex-wife was quietly signing the paperwork to purchase the very company that paid his salary. The ink on the divorce decree was barely dry, but Zelda Hayes was already celebrating like a man who had just won the lottery. The VIP section of the Onyx, downtown Chicago's most exclusive nightclub, was roped off for him and his closest friends. At 34, Zelda was a senior vice president of acquisitions at Oakmont Corporate Solutions, a mid-sized but highly profitable logistics and consulting firm. He was tall, meticulously groomed, and wore his arrogance like a bespoke suit. Sitting on his lap was LaDonna Carmichael, a 24-year-old junior executive from Oakmont's marketing department. She was everything his ex-wife was not: loud, flashy, and endlessly impressed by Zelda's title and credit limit. "I still can't believe she didn't fight you for the house, man," Brad, Zelda's closest friend and fellow executive, yelled over the pulsating rhythm of the club's sound system. Brad took a heavy sip of his scotch, shaking his head. "I mean, a 5-bedroom in the suburbs? She just walked away?" Zelda smirked, swirling the champagne in his flute. "Patrick has no stomach for conflict, Brad. She never did. She's a freelance bookkeeper who works in her pajamas. When my lawyer slammed those papers down and threatened a protracted legal battle over her little savings account, she folded like a cheap lawn chair. She kept her old sedan and her freelance business, and I kept my life." LaDonna giggled, pressing her lips to Zelda's jaw. "She just didn't belong in your world, baby. You're moving up. You need someone who understands the corporate grind, not someone who makes grocery lists for fun." "Exactly," Zelda agreed, his chest puffing out. He truly believed it. For the last 3 years of their 5-year marriage, Zelda had viewed Patrick as an anchor holding down his soaring hot air balloon. She was quiet, preferred reading over networking galas, and never seemed to care about luxury brands or climbing the social ladder. When Zelda landed his SVP role, the gap between them, at least in his mind, became an ocean. He was a titan of industry. She was a domestic afterthought. 10 miles away, in a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline, the domestic afterthought was staring out at the city lights. Patrick Hayes, soon to be Patrick Sterling again, took a slow sip of her Earl Grey tea. She was dressed in comfortable cashmere loungewear, her dark hair pulled into a messy knot. The penthouse was silent, a stark contrast to the thumping club where she knew her ex-husband was currently parading his mistress. The heavy oak doors of her private home office opened, and Arthur Pendleton stepped in. Arthur was a silver-haired shark of a man, a senior partner at one of the most feared corporate law firms on the Eastern Seaboard. He was also Patrick's lead counsel and trusted confidant. "The final documents from the family court have been filed, Patrick," Arthur said, placing a slim manila folder on her massive mahogany desk. "Zelda Hayes is officially no longer your husband. And as expected, he waived his right to any deep discovery into your business assets, satisfied with the residential property and his own stock options." Patrick turned away from the window, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. He was so desperate to protect his precious Oakmont stock that he didn't even look twice at Meridian Holdings. Arthur chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. To be fair, Patrick, you buried your ownership of Meridian behind 3 blind trusts, a proxy board in Delaware, and an offshore holding firm. But yes, his sheer arrogance blinded him. His lawyer assumed your freelance consulting yielded $50,000 a year. They didn't realize you were consulting for Fortune 500 companies and sitting on a private equity empire worth nearly $2 billion. Patrick walked over to the desk and rested her hand on the folder. The betrayal still stung, a dull ache in her chest. She had loved Zelda once, back when they were just 2 college graduates eating ramen and dreaming of the future. But as Zelda tasted corporate success, he changed. He became cruel, dismissive, and ultimately unfaithful. Patrick had discovered the affair with LaDonna 6 months ago. Instead of crying, she had called Arthur. "And the Oakmont acquisition?" Patrick asked, her voice turning crisp, all traces of sentimentality vanishing. "Finalized an hour ago," Arthur confirmed, handing her a sleek tablet. "Meridian Holdings has officially purchased Oakmont Corporate Solutions for $450 million in cash. The current CEO, Richard Brooks, has been informed that the majority shareholder of Meridian will be making an in-person appearance on Monday morning to address the executive board and outline the restructuring process." Patrick looked at the tablet, her eyes scanning the digital signatures that handed her the keys to her ex-husband's kingdom. "Does Richard know my name?" "No," Arthur smiled. "Only that the head of Meridian is stepping out of the shadows. The entire Oakmont executive team is terrified. Rumor has it they are expecting a ruthless, 60-year-old Wall Street tycoon to come in and slash jobs." "Well," Patrick said softly, picking up her teacup, "they have the ruthless part right." To understand Zelda's catastrophic miscalculation, one had to understand the dynamic of their marriage. Patrick had inherited a modest sum from her late grandfather in her early 20s, but rather than spend it, she invested it. She possessed a terrifyingly brilliant mind for market trends and distressed assets. By the time she married Zelda, she had quietly turned $200,000 into $4 million. By their 3rd anniversary, through aggressive acquisitions and the formation of Meridian Holdings, she was a billionaire. But Patrick valued her privacy above all else. She had seen wealth destroy her grandfather's side of the family, turning siblings into enemies. She wanted a normal life. She wanted a husband who loved her for her, not for her bank account. So, she kept her wealth hidden behind ironclad NDAs and corporate shells. She told Zelda she was a freelance financial consultant. She paid her half of the bills from a modest checking account, drove a practical Honda, and allowed Zelda to take pride in being the primary breadwinner. For a while it worked, but as Zelda climbed the ranks at Oakmont, his ego swelled. He began to belittle her. "You wouldn't understand, Patrick," he would say during dinners, waving his fork dismissively when she tried to offer advice on his corporate strategy. "It's high-level logistics. It's not balancing a local bakery's checkbook." She had bitten her tongue. She had bitten her tongue when he criticized her simple wardrobe, urging her to buy designer labels so she wouldn't embarrass him in front of his colleagues. She had bitten her tongue when he started working late, coming home smelling of expensive gin and cheap perfume. The breaking point had been a Tuesday afternoon. Patrick had used her administrative access to track Zelda's location, worried when he hadn't answered his phone during a supposed high-stakes off-site. The tracker had led her to a boutique hotel downtown. She had sat in her car across the street and watched her husband walk out of the lobby, his hand casually resting on the lower back of a young blonde woman from his office. They had kissed before parting ways. Patrick hadn't confronted him. Confrontation was messy. Patrick was a woman of strategy. The divorce mediation had been a masterclass in psychological manipulation, orchestrated entirely by Patrick and Arthur. They had sat in a sterile conference room in downtown Chicago. Zelda had worn a smug, pitying expression, flanked by his aggressive, overpriced divorce attorney. "My client is willing to be generous," Zelda's lawyer had barked across the table. "He will take the primary residence in Evanston, the BMW, and his entire 401k and stock options from Oakmont. In exchange, he will not seek alimony from Mrs. Hayes, and he will allow her to keep her savings accounts, her vehicle, and the sole proprietorship of her freelance consulting firm. We want a clean break." Arthur had pretended to look outraged. "Mr. Hayes is walking away with the lion's share of the marital assets, the equity in the house alone." "I paid the mortgage, Arthur," Zelda had interrupted, leaning forward, looking directly at Patrick. "Let's be real, Patrick. I built this life. I paid for the house. I earned the promotions. You've been coasting on my success for 3 years while you play on your laptop. Take the deal. If we go to trial, I'll bury you in legal fees, and you'll end up with nothing." Patrick had looked down at her hands, feigning submission. Inside, she was a predator, watching a mouse walk willingly into a trap. If Zelda's lawyers had demanded a full forensic audit of her businesses, they might have pierced the corporate veil and discovered her connection to Meridian. By letting Zelda think he was bullying her out of the house, she kept his eyes off the prize. "Okay," Patrick had whispered, letting a single, perfectly timed tear slip down her cheek. "I'll sign. Just let me keep my business." Zelda had smiled, a predatory grin that made her stomach turn. "Of course, Patrick, you can keep your little hobby." That little hobby had just bought his entire corporate existence. Over the weekend following the divorce finalization, Zelda moved LaDonna into the Evanston house. He spent Saturday buying a massive new flat-screen television and Sunday golfing with Brad. Life was perfect. He was a rising star at Oakmont. With the rumors of the company being acquired by a massive private equity firm, Zelda was certain the current, aging CEO, Richard Brooks, would be forced out, paving the way for a younger, hungrier president. Zelda was ready to kiss the ring of the new owner and step into the corner office. Monday morning at Oakmont Corporate Solutions was suffocatingly tense. The air in the sprawling, modern office building hummed with the frantic energy of an anthill that had just been kicked. The acquisition by Meridian Holdings had been officially announced to the staff at 7 a.m. via a company-wide email. By 8:30 a.m., the panic was palpable. Meridian was known in the financial world as a silent giant, ruthless, efficient, and intolerant of corporate bloat. Zelda walked off the elevator onto the executive floor, looking like he belonged on the cover of GQ. He wore a brand-new charcoal Tom Ford suit, a crisp white shirt, and a power red silk tie. LaDonna met him in the hallway, holding 2 cups of artisanal coffee. "Everyone is freaking out," LaDonna whispered, handing him a cup, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Richard looks like he's about to have a heart attack. He's pacing in his office." "Let them panic," Zelda said smoothly, taking a sip of the coffee. "Meridian didn't buy us to burn us down. They bought us to scale. They're going to trim the fat. And Richard is the fattest piece of dead wood in this building. When the new owner comes in today, I'm going to show him that I am the future of this company." "You're so brilliant," LaDonna purred, adjusting his lapel. At 9:45 a.m., an urgent summons was sent to all executives and senior department heads. Mandatory meeting in the primary boardroom at 10 a.m. The majority shareholder of Meridian Holdings has arrived. The boardroom at Oakmont was a glass-enclosed theater of power, featuring a massive 30-foot polished oak table surrounded by leather chairs. When Zelda entered, The room was already packed. The tension was thick enough to slice with a letter opener. Richard Brooks, a man in his late 50s who usually projected an aura of absolute authority, was sweating through his shirt at the head of the table. Zelda claimed a seat near the front, right next to Brad. He leaned back, exuding relaxed confidence, placing his Mont Blanc pen on his leather portfolio. "Heard anything about the new boss?" Brad muttered, loosening his tie. "Just that he's a phantom," Zelda whispered back. "Nobody knows who actually runs Meridian. It's managed by a board of directors, but the majority owner pulls all the strings from the shadows. Probably some old money billionaire from New York. Just let me do the talking when the floor opens." At precisely 10 a.m., the heavy oak double doors leading into the executive suite clicked open. The murmuring in the boardroom died instantly. 40 pairs of eyes locked onto the glass walls, watching the hallway. First came a team of 3 sharp-looking men in dark suits, lawyers or fixers, carrying sleek briefcases. Behind them walked Arthur Pendleton, looking every bit the ruthless legal titan he was. And then, walking calmly behind Arthur, was the owner. Zelda's breath hitched in his throat. His brain immediately short-circuited, struggling to process the visual information being fed to it. It was a woman. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored white Alexander McQueen suit that commanded the room before she even stepped inside. Her dark hair was blown out perfectly, cascading over her shoulders. She wore stiletto heels that clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Her posture was flawless, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying power. It was Patrick. Zelda blinked rapidly, his heart slamming against his ribs. "No," he thought, panic clawing at his chest. "No, that's impossible. That's a mistake. She's supposed to be in her pajamas. She's a freelancer. She drives a 10-year-old Honda." Beside him, Brad frowned. "Hey, Zelda, isn't that—" Zelda couldn't speak. He felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and clammy. Patrick walked into the boardroom, ignoring the stunned silence. She didn't even glance at Zelda. She walked directly to the head of the table. Richard Brooks scrambled out of the main chair, looking like a deer caught in the headlights, and gestured for her to sit. Patrick didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, resting her manicured hands lightly on the polished oak. She swept her gaze across the room, her eyes sharp, cold, and calculating. When her gaze finally landed on Zelda, seated in the second chair to her right, she didn't flinch. She didn't sneer. She looked at him with the chilling indifference of someone observing a speck of dirt on their shoe. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Good morning, everyone. I am Arthur Pendleton, Chief Legal Counsel for Meridian Holdings. It is my privilege to introduce you to the founder, majority shareholder, and CEO of Meridian, Ms. Patrick Hayes." The room remained dead silent, save for a collective intake of breath. Several executives who had attended Zelda's lavish wedding 3 years ago exchanged horrified, bewildered glances. Patrick finally spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried a weight that pinned every person to their seat. "Good morning," Patrick said, her tone professional, but entirely devoid of warmth. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, Oakmont Corporate Solutions is a wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Holdings. We have spent the last 6 months analyzing your financials, your operational efficiency, and your leadership." She paused, and her eyes flicked back to Zelda. He was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, looking as though he had been hit by a truck. "I build companies," Patrick continued, her voice echoing slightly in the glass room. "I do not tolerate inefficiency. I do not tolerate arrogance. And I absolutely do not tolerate dead weight." She used the exact phrase Zelda had shouted in the VIP lounge of the Onyx just days prior. Zelda swallowed hard, tasting bile in the back of his throat. There will be a comprehensive restructuring of the executive board, Patrick announced. Some of you will be given the tools to thrive in this new era. Others, she offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, will find that their services are no longer required. She looked directly at Richard Brooks. Richard, my team will need your office immediately. Please clear out your personal effects. Richard turned pale but nodded quickly. Yes, Miss Hayes. Of course. Patrick then turned her attention directly to Zelda. The silence in the room became agonizing. Zelda felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. The man who had been so eager to kiss the ring of the new owner suddenly realized he was kneeling before the executioner he had created. Mr. Sterling, Patrick said, using his last name with surgical precision. See, Patrick, Zelda stammered, his polished arrogance shattering into a million pieces. I don't understand. That, Patrick said, tilting her head slightly, has been the prevailing theme of our entire relationship, Zelda. Arthur stepped forward and handed Patrick a thick manila folder. It looked identical to the divorce papers she had signed just days ago. Patrick dropped the folder onto the table directly in front of Zelda. It landed with a heavy, final thud. Let's get down to business, Patrick said softly. The manila folder lay on the polished oak table like an unexploded bomb. Zelda stared at it, his hands trembling slightly. The murmurs in the boardroom had ceased completely. 40 executives held their collective breath, watching a corporate execution unfold in real time. Open it, Zelda, Patrick instructed, her voice devoid of the warmth he had taken for granted for 5 years. She wasn't the quiet woman in sweatpants anymore. She was a titan, standing at the head of the table, radiating the kind of ruthless authority you usually only read about in Forbes profiles of Carly Khan or Warren Buffett. Zelda reached out, his fingers stiff, and flipped open the cover. Inside was a meticulous, brutal accounting of his entire career at Oakmont Corporate Solutions. It wasn't a standard HR file. It was a forensic audit conducted by Meridian's top analysts. When Meridian acquires a distressed asset, Patrick began, pacing slowly behind the empty chair of the former CEO. We look for the leak. Oakmont has been bleeding revenue for 18 months. Your board, she gestured dismissively to the pale executives around the room, blamed market volatility. But my analysts found the truth. The leak wasn't the market. It was a staggering culture of incompetence, led primarily by the acquisitions department. Zelda's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. Patrick, this is insane. You're doing this because you're bitter about the divorce. I am a billionaire, Mr. Sterling. Patrick cut him off, her tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. I do not waste my time or my capital on petty domestic squabbles. I bought Oakmont because its core logistics infrastructure is highly valuable to my broader portfolio. I am restructuring this executive board because you are, objectively, terrible at your job. Arthur Pendleton adjusted his glasses and stepped forward, tapping the folder in front of Zelda. Page 3, Mr. Sterling. Let's review. Patrick didn't even look at the notes. She had them memorized. Over the last fiscal year, Zelda, you championed the acquisition of 3 regional supply chain firms. You promised this board a 20% yield in synergy savings. Instead, you overpaid by an average of 35% because you failed to conduct basic due diligence on their pension liabilities. Brad, sitting next to Zelda, winced and instinctively leaned an inch away from his friend. Patrick continued, her voice echoing in the glass room. But incompetence is just the beginning. Let's look at the culture of entitlement you fostered. In the last 12 months, you have expensed the following to the company: $42,000 in client entertainment at high-end steakhouses and nightclubs, including the Onyx, where no actual clients were present. $18,500 in chartered flights to golf tournaments, disguised as industry networking. $12,000 in luxury hotel stays downtown, booked during the middle of the work week. At the mention of the downtown hotels, a few eyes flicked toward the glass walls of the boardroom, where LaDonna was standing with the other junior staff, her face drained of all color. The entire office knew about the affair, and now they knew Zelda had been using company funds to finance it. "You treated Oakmont like your personal piggy bank," Patrick said, stopping at the end of the table and locking eyes with him. "You built an illusion of success on the back of padded expense reports and catastrophic deals. You looked down on everyone around you, convinced of your own superiority while driving this company into the ground." "You can't do this," Zelda hissed, his voice cracking. He looked around the room, desperately seeking an ally. "Brad, tell her. We brought in the Miller account. We secured the West Coast contracts." Brad looked down at his legal pad, suddenly very interested in the blank lines. Nobody was going to stand up to the woman who now held all their paychecks. "The Miller account," Patrick noted dryly, "is currently threatening to pull their business because your team missed 3 consecutive shipping milestones. As for you, Zelda, your position as Senior Vice President of Acquisitions is hereby eliminated. The department is being dissolved and absorbed by Meridian's central team." Zelda slumped in his chair. It was over. The divorce, the house, the car. It all felt like ashes in his mouth. He had traded a loyal billionaire for a 24-year-old who was currently hiding behind a water cooler. "Fine," he spat, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "Fire me. Give me my severance package and I'll walk." Patrick smiled. It was a terrifying, chilling smile. "Fire you?" she asked softly. "Oh, Zelda, you aren't getting off that easily." 2 hours later, the bloodbath on the executive floor was over. 7 senior vice presidents had been handed their walking papers. Richard Brooks had been escorted out of the building by security, clutching a cardboard box of golf trophies. Zelda was sitting in his corner office, staring blankly at the Chicago skyline. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from LaDonna, but he ignored them. He was waiting for HR to bring him his termination papers. He mentally calculated his safety net. He had the Evanston house, his savings, and, crucially, his vested and unvested Oakmont stock options, which he had fought so ruthlessly to keep in the divorce. He could sell the stock, cash out, and start over at a rival firm. The door to his office clicked open. Patrick walked in alone. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, crossing her arms. Without the audience of the boardroom, the air between them grew heavy with the ghosts of their dead marriage. "I have to admit," Zelda sneered, his anger masking his panic. "It was a hell of a show, Patrick. You played the long game. I'll give you that. Where do I sign my exit papers?" Patrick walked over to his desk and sat casually on the edge of it, looking down at him. "There are no exit papers, Zelda." He frowned, his brow furrowing. "You literally just dissolved my department in front of 50 people." "I did," Patrick nodded. "Your SVP role is gone. However, I am not firing you. You are being reassigned." Zelda let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Reassigned? To what? You think I'm going to stay here and work for you? I'll quit." "You won't," Patrick said simply. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across his desk. "Because of the golden handcuffs you insisted on wearing." Zelda looked at the document. It was a copy of his employment contract, specifically the executive compensation addendum he had signed 3 years ago. "When you were promoted to SVP," Patrick explained, her voice conversational, almost academic. You demanded a massive equity stake in Oakmont. The board agreed, but they attached an ironclad non-compete clause and a punitive clawback provision. Do you remember what it says? Zelda's stomach plummeted. He remembered. If you resign, or if you are terminated with cause, and fraud via padded expense accounts certainly constitutes cause, you forfeit all unvested stock, Patrick recited smoothly. Furthermore, the non-compete prevents you from working in logistics, consulting, or acquisitions anywhere in North America for 3 years. Zelda stared at her, horrified. But we divorced. I kept my stock in the settlement. You kept the rights to your stock, Patrick corrected him gently, like a teacher explaining a simple math problem to a slow student. But the vesting schedule and the employment stipulations still apply. The stock is currently worth about $2.5 million. If you quit today, you lose all of it. If I fire you for your fraudulent expenses, you lose all of it, and I report you to the SEC. Zelda felt the room spin. He had fought so hard in the divorce to keep those options, gloating that he had outsmarted her. He had traded her cash and investments for company paper. So what are you saying? Zelda whispered, his arrogance entirely shattered. I'm saying you are going to stay, Patrick replied. You are being reassigned to the position of Regional Operations Analyst. You will be moving from this corner office to a cubicle on the 3rd floor. Your base salary is being adjusted to match the new role, $75,000 a year. 75? Zelda choked out. The mortgage on the Evanston house, the payments on his luxury BMW, the country club fees. His monthly overhead was astronomical. He couldn't survive on that salary. I can't pay my bills with that, Patrick. You know that. That sounds like a personal budgeting issue, Zelda, Patrick said, her expression entirely neutral. Perhaps you should consult a freelance bookkeeper to help you manage your finances. The callback hit him like a physical blow. You'll report directly to the new director of operations, Patrick continued, standing up and smoothing her blazer. A woman named Sarah Jenkins. I believe you previously passed her over for a promotion because you said she lacked killer instinct. She's very eager to manage your daily deliverables. Zelda was trapped. If he quit, he would be blacklisted from his industry, lose his millions in stock, and face a lawsuit for his fraudulent expenses. If he stayed, he would be humiliated daily, working a grueling, entry-level job for a fraction of his former pay, reporting to a woman he had actively disrespected, all while his ex-wife ruled from the penthouse. You planned this, Zelda breathed, staring at her as if she were a monster. You let me take the stock in the divorce. You let me think I won. Patrick walked to the door and paused, her hand on the handle. She finally allowed a small, genuine smile to touch her lips. I didn't plan for you to betray me, Zelda, Patrick said softly. But once you did, I simply let your own greed dig the grave. See you at the quarterly review. She stepped out, pulling the door shut with a quiet click, leaving Zelda entirely alone in the ruins of the life he thought he had built. The transition from the executive penthouse to the 3rd floor operational bullpen was a grueling, public humiliation. Zelda Hayes, the man who had just days ago toasted to dropping dead weight, now found himself carrying a single cardboard box containing his Mont Blanc pen, a framed photo of his BMW, and a customized leather desk pad down 3 flights of stairs. His access to the private executive elevator had been revoked before he even left his former corner office. The 3rd floor smelled of stale coffee, ozone from the copy machines, and the quiet desperation of middle management. It was a stark contrast to the mahogany and leather of the suite he had occupied. When Zelda arrived at his new workspace, a grey, fabric-lined cubicle situated directly outside the men's restroom, The entire floor went dead silent. Dozens of eyes, belonging to the very people he had ignored or berated for the past 3 years, tracked his every move. Waiting for him at the cubicle was Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a 42-year-old logistics veteran with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense bob. Zelda had once described her in an executive meeting as lacking the killer instinct required for modern acquisitions, effectively killing her promotion to vice president. Sarah smiled, handing him a thick 3-ring binder. "Welcome to operations, Zelda. I understand from Ms. Hayes that you'll be handling the legacy data migration for our regional warehouses. It's manual entry, over 80,000 line items. I need the first batch completed and verified by Friday." Zelda stared at the binder, his jaw tightening. "Sarah, you know as well as I do that data migration is a job for an intern. I was an SVP." "You were an SVP," Sarah corrected smoothly, tapping the binder. "Now, you're an operations analyst, making $75,000 a year. And frankly, Zelda, given the audit of your recent acquisitions, I'm not entirely convinced you're qualified for this. But Ms. Hayes insisted we give you a chance to prove your worth. Lunch is at noon. Don't be late with those reports." The following weeks were a masterclass in psychological torture. Zelda was buried under mountains of tedious, mind-numbing spreadsheet work. If he made a single formatting error, Sarah would send it back with a red-inked note, treating him like a junior college student. He was excluded from all high-level meetings. When he walked into the break room, conversations stopped. He was a pariah, a living cautionary tale of Patrick's absolute power. But the professional humiliation paled in comparison to the financial apocalypse closing in on him. Zelda had built his life on the assumption of a $300,000 base salary, supplemented by hefty annual bonuses. His monthly overhead was staggering. The mortgage on the 5-bedroom Evanston house was $8,000 a month. The lease on his BMW 7 Series was $1,500. He had memberships to the Oak Brook Golf Club, a personal trainer, and maxed-out credit cards from his months of treating LaDonna to Michelin-starred dinners and weekend trips to Miami. When his first drastically reduced paycheck hit his bank account, the reality of his situation crystallized. After taxes, it barely covered half of his mortgage. He sat at the kitchen island of his cavernous, empty suburban house, staring at his laptop screen. His checking account was hemorrhaging money. He tried to call Brad to ask for a short-term loan, but the call went straight to voicemail. Brad, desperate to survive Patrick's corporate purge, had completely severed ties with Zelda. Then came the final, inevitable fracture in his perfect new life. LaDonna had initially tried to play the supportive girlfriend, mostly because she hadn't fully grasped the severity of the demotion. But as the weeks dragged on, the glamorous perks vanished. There were no more VIP tables at the Onyx. There were no more spontaneous shopping sprees on Michigan Avenue. Instead of commanding the room, Zelda came home exhausted, smelling of cheap break-room coffee, complaining bitterly about spreadsheets and Sarah Jenkins. The breaking point arrived on a Friday evening. Zelda was sitting on the sofa, nursing a cheap beer. He couldn't afford the Macallan 18 anymore when LaDonna walked out of the master bedroom. She was rolling a large Louis Vuitton suitcase behind her, one that Zelda had bought for her just 2 months prior. Zelda sat up, his heart dropping. "LaDonna, what are you doing?" She wouldn't look him in the eye. She wore a sleek trench coat and held her phone tightly in her hand. "I'm leaving, Zelda. I can't do this anymore." "Can't do what?" he pleaded, standing up. "Things are tight right now, but I'll figure it out. I'll find a loophole in the non-compete. We can sell the house, downsize for a bit." "I didn't sign up to downsize," LaDonna interrupted, her voice sharp and entirely devoid of the breathy adoration she used to shower him with. "I'm 24, Zelda. I'm not going to spend my 20s sitting in the suburbs watching you stress over a mortgage you can't pay. You're a joke at the office. Everyone is laughing at you. I'm taking a job at a marketing firm in New York. I leave tomorrow." "You're leaving me because I lost my money?" Zelda asked, the betrayal stinging more than he expected. LaDonna finally looked at him, her expression a mix of pity and disdain. "I'm leaving you because you're a loser, Zelda. You thought you were the smartest guy in the room, but your wife played you for an absolute fool. You have nothing." She walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind her, echoing through the empty, unpaid-for house. Zelda was entirely alone. By the beginning of the 4th month, the crushing reality of Zelda's new existence had moved from a psychological torment to a brutal, mathematical certainty. He was drowning, and the water was rising by the day. The lifestyle he had so meticulously curated, the one he had smugly protected during the divorce mediation, was rapidly collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. His morning routine no longer involved reading the Wall Street Journal over a fresh espresso. It consisted of dodging aggressive phone calls from the collections department at American Express. His platinum card had been frozen after he missed 2 consecutive minimum payments. 3 days later, a starkly worded letter from the Oak Brook Golf Club arrived via certified mail, unceremoniously terminating his membership for delinquent dues. But the most pressing terror was the Evanston house, the sprawling, 5-bedroom suburban estate with its custom millwork and 3-car garage was a gaping financial black hole. Between the $8,000 monthly mortgage, the soaring Illinois property taxes, and the utility bills, his new $75,000 salary was mathematically incapable of sustaining him. He was eating cheap ramen noodles in a dining room designed for lavish dinner parties, drinking bottom-shelf Jim Beam instead of the Macallan 18 he used to pour for his fellow executives. Desperation drove him to the only logical conclusion. He had to liquidate. He had to sell the house, take the hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity he assumed he possessed, pay off his mounting credit card debt, and survive until his 3-year non-compete clause expired. He hired a top-tier real estate agent from Sotheby's, agreeing to price the property aggressively to ensure a rapid close. Within 2 weeks, they secured a buyer willing to pay $1.25 million in cash. For a brief, shining moment, Zelda felt the suffocating pressure ease. He mentally calculated the math as he drove his leased BMW 7 Series, which was currently 2 months behind on payments and actively facing repossession, to the downtown Chicago offices of Fidelity National Title. He had purchased the house for just under $1 million, and the primary mortgage balance sat at roughly $850,000. Even after the realtor commissions and closing costs, he anticipated walking away with a certified check for over $300,000. It would be his salvation. It would be his escape hatch from Patrick's meticulously designed prison. Zelda walked into the sleek, glass-walled conference room of the title company, carrying a worn leather portfolio. He sat opposite Gregory Mitchell, a senior escrow officer with thinning hair and a perpetually apologetic expression. "Mr. Sterling," Gregory said, adjusting his reading glasses as he pushed a thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table. "We have the closing disclosure ready for your signature. The buyers have already wired the funds into escrow, so once we clear these pages, we can disperse your proceeds." Zelda exhaled a long, shaky breath, loosening his tie. "Fantastic, Gregory. Just point to where I need to sign. And please ensure the wire transfer is routed to my primary Chase checking account by end of business today. I have some investments I need to reallocate immediately." Gregory offered a tight, polite smile, but his eyes dropped to the settlement statement with a hint of discomfort. Of course. Let's review the final numbers. The gross sale price is $1.25 million. We will first pay off the primary mortgage held by First National, which has a current principal and interest payoff of $848,200. Right. Zelda nodded impatiently, tapping his pen against the table. Leaving about $400,000, minus your fees and the broker commissions. Gregory cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to echo ominously in the quiet room. Well, not exactly, Mr. Sterling. We also have to clear the secondary encumbrance recorded against the property's title. Zelda's hand froze mid-tap. He stared at the escrow officer, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. What secondary encumbrance? There is no secondary lien. I didn't take out a second mortgage when Patrick and I bought the place. It's not a traditional second mortgage, Gregory explained gently, sliding a specific page of the disclosure out from the stack and turning it toward Zelda. It is a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, originated through Wells Fargo, recorded 22 months ago. It appears the line was drawn upon quite heavily over the past year and a half. The payoff demand from Wells Fargo to clear the title is $324,600. Zelda felt the blood drain entirely from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy. A high-pitched ringing sound started in his ears. 22 months ago. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was right around the time his affair with LaDonna had started. He had wanted to impress her. He had wanted to play the role of the untouchable corporate titan. He remembered sitting in a private room at the Onyx, buying $3,000 bottles of champagne. He remembered chartering a private Gulfstream jet for a weekend getaway to Cabo San Lucas because LaDonna had complained about flying commercial. He remembered the Cartier diamond tennis bracelet he had bought her for her 23rd birthday. He had funded the entire illusion by secretly pulling equity out of the house, terrified that Patrick would notice if he touched their joint liquid savings. He had convinced himself that his end-of-year executive bonuses would easily cover the debt. But the bonuses had vanished the moment Patrick acquired Oakmont. "Mr. Sterling?" Gregory asked softly, noting Zelda's pale, stricken face. "Are you all right?" Zelda couldn't speak. He stared at the numbers on the page, but they were blurring together. After the primary mortgage, the HELOC payoff, the city and county transfer taxes, and the 6% realtor commissions, Gregory tapped a few keys on his desktop calculator, the clacking sound deafening in Zelda's ears. Your final net cash to close is exactly $1,852. $1,800. The house was his life raft, and he had just realized it was made of lead. It was the crowning achievement of his divorce settlement. He had fought his own wife tooth and nail in mediation, gloating that he had outsmarted her by securing the real estate. But Patrick hadn't fought him for the house because she knew. As a financial genius, she undoubtedly had Arthur Pendleton run a quiet title search during the divorce proceedings. She knew the house was leveraged to the hilt. She had deliberately let him fight for a drowning anchor, stepping aside to watch him pull it around his own neck. Raw, suffocating panic seized him. He didn't sign the papers. He couldn't. He grabbed his portfolio, practically sprinting out of the Fidelity National offices. He ignored the valet, throwing himself into the driver's seat of his BMW and peeling out into the downtown Chicago traffic. He drove recklessly toward the towering glass and steel headquarters of Meridian Holdings. He didn't go to his assigned cubicle on the 3rd floor. He bypassed the security desk entirely, tailgating a group of senior executives into the private elevator bank, and slammed his hand against the button for the penthouse suite. When the doors parted, he marched past Patrick's astonished executive assistant, ignoring her protests, and burst through the heavy oak double doors of the CEO's office. Arthur Pendleton was sitting in a leather wingback chair opposite Patrick's massive desk, casually reviewing a thick-bound contract. Patrick was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city skyline, holding a cup of Earl Grey tea. She wore a tailored, dark navy blazer and looked entirely unbothered by the sudden intrusion. "Security is already on their way up, Mr. Sterling," Arthur noted, without looking up from his reading, his voice a dry, rasping drawl. "Patrick, please," Zelda begged, his voice cracking violently. The polished, arrogant executive was entirely gone. He was a broken, frantic man, trembling as he stood on the plush Persian rug. "Please, I'm ruined. The house is gone. The debt, the credit cards. I have nothing. I can't survive on the analyst salary. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll sign a lifetime NDA. Just release me from the non-compete. Let me forfeit the stock and walk away. Let me go to another firm. I'm begging you on my hands and knees." Patrick took a slow sip of her tea, turned around, and leaned casually against the glass window. She looked at Zelda, really looked at him. She saw the panicked sweat soaking his collar, the poorly knotted tie, the hollow, desperate terror in his eyes. "Do you remember what you told my lawyer during the mediation, Zelda?" Patrick asked. Her voice was soft, melodic, yet carried a lethal, surgical edge. Zelda swallowed hard, unable to force a single word past the lump in his throat. "You sat across from me," Patrick continued, taking slow, deliberate steps toward her desk. "You looked me dead in the eye, and you said, 'I built this life. You've been coasting on my success. Take the deal or I'll bury you.' Do you recall those words?" A tear leaked from the corner of Zelda's eye, tracking through the cold sweat on his cheek. "You wanted to keep everything you built," Patrick said, resting her hands on the edge of her desk, leaning toward him. "So, I let you? You built the secret Hellock debt to fund your mistress. You built the fraudulent expense reports. You built the restrictive, ironclad employment contract because your ego demanded a golden parachute. You built the illusion of your own superiority. I didn't destroy you, Zelda. I didn't take a single thing from you. I just forced you to live inside the exact house you constructed." "Patrick, they're going to repossess my car," Zelda sobbed, his pride entirely shattered. "I have $2,000 to my name. If I stay here on that salary, I'll have to declare bankruptcy." Arthur Pendleton finally closed his folder and stood up, adjusting his silver tie. "Bankruptcy is the least of your concerns, Mr. Sterling." Zelda snapped his head toward the lawyer, a new wave of dread washing over him. What do you mean? Did you really think the golden handcuffs were just about keeping you in a cubicle?" Arthur asked, a terrifyingly serene smile on his face. "If you attempt to break your contract, or if you refuse to perform your duties as an operations analyst, Meridian Holdings will immediately terminate you for cause, and upon that termination, my legal team will submit the findings of our forensic audit, specifically the $42,000 in fabricated client dinners and the $18,000 in personal chartered flights, directly to the Chicago District Attorney's Office for corporate fraud and embezzlement." Zelda's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the back of a visitor's chair to keep from collapsing. "You can stay on the third floor, earn your $75,000, and slowly work off your insurmountable debt," Patrick finalized, her voice devoid of any lingering affection or malice. It was purely transactional. "Or you can quit, forfeit your stock, face criminal charges, and spend the next 3 to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. The choice is entirely yours, Zelda. We are offering you a steady paycheck. You should be grateful." The heavy oak doors opened behind him. 2 massive security guards stepped into the office, their expressions grim. "Miss Hayes?" one of them asked cautiously. "Mr. Sterling was just leaving," Patrick said, turning her back on him and walking back to the window to admire the city she owned. "Escort him back down to the 3rd floor. He has data migration reports due to Sarah Jenkins by 5 o'clock. We wouldn't want him to fall behind on his deliverables." "Patrick, please!" Zelda shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls as the guards grabbed him by the arms, pulling him backward out of the office. "You can't do this! I have nothing! Patrick!" Patrick didn't flinch. She picked up her teacup, looking at her lawyer. "Arthur, let's review the logistics merger for the West Coast expansion. I want to look at the Seattle port acquisitions." She never even looked back as the doors clicked shut, severing the final tie to her past. 10 minutes later, Zelda was deposited back at his fabric-lined cubicle outside the men's restroom. The entire 3rd floor was silent, watching him. Sarah Jenkins walked over, holding a fresh, massive stack of printed spreadsheets. She dropped them onto his desk with a heavy, dismissive thud. "The regional routing numbers need to be manually cross-referenced by tomorrow morning, Zelda," Sarah said flatly. "I expect them on my desk by 8 a.m. Don't make me write you up again." Zelda sat down in his cheap, creaking office chair. He stared at the mountain of paper, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry hornets. He had chased the illusion of power, sacrificed his marriage for vanity, and celebrated his divorce with champagne. Now, the champagne was gone, the mistress had fled, and the billionaire he had underestimated owned the rest of his life. He slowly reached out, uncapped his cheap plastic pen, and began to work. Zelda Hayes had toasted to freedom with a glass of Dom Perignon, convinced he had masterfully discarded a woman he viewed as a quiet, domestic burden. In his blinding arrogance, he mistook Patrick's silence for weakness, failing to realize that true power rarely needs to announce itself. He fought ruthlessly for the shiny remnants of an illusion, a leveraged house, a leased car, and corporate stock chained to his own hubris. Patrick, meanwhile, orchestrated a flawless checkmate, not through vengeance, but through absolute, cold accountability. She simply allowed Zelda to consume the very poison he had poured. Now, trapped in a cubicle of his own making, stripped of his wealth, his mistress, and his pride, Zelda learned the ultimate, devastating lesson. The most dangerous people in the room are never the loudest. They are the ones silently buying the building while you boast about the view.